News of the times. The clergyman who hid his wife's murder. The shocking case of the Reverend Selby Watson in 1871. Stockwell, London, 1871. Today's case takes us into a quiet Victorian street in Stockwell, where a respected clergyman, a scholar, a headmaster, a man of impeccable public standing, calmly told his servant that his wife had gone out of town for a few days. What no one realized was that she would never be seen alive again. What followed was a calculated attempt to hide a terrible crime, a locked room, a chilling confession, and a box ordered to very particular measurements that later raised far more questions than they answered. This is the story of the Reverend John Selby Watson, a man whose life appeared orderly, diligent, and entirely unremarkable until the moment everything cracked. Was this a sudden loss of control, a long-buried rage, or something far darker, something the Victorian courts struggled to define? Today we uncover the truth behind one of London's most unsettling domestic murders of the 1870s, a case that shocked the clergy, divided medical experts, and forced the justice system to confront what it called a moment of ungovernable fury. And in today's further particulars, 3 cats, 2 furious ladies, and 1 baffled judge, all to determine whether a Persian stud was in fact just Dave from Camden. Victorian justice never disappoints. And if this sounds more appealing than Aunt Edna's mulled wine, do give us a like and settle in. Popcorn optional. Life of a Victorian headmaster in 1871. To understand this case, we must first step inside the world of a Victorian headmaster in 1871, a world that was not nearly as comfortable or respectable as it might appear in retrospect. The Reverend Selby Watson was a master of a proprietary grammar school in Stockwell, a private institution entirely dependent on its fees, its reputation, and the confidence of parents. Such schools were small businesses as much as centres of learning. A decline in enrolment, a rumour about discipline, or the opening of a rival school could destabilise them overnight. And in 1871, it was a difficult year to be running one. The Education Act of 1870, the first major attempt to provide schooling for all children, had just begun reshaping the entire landscape. For the first time, publicly funded board schools offered an alternative to the old patchwork of private, church and charity institutions. Fees were lower, buildings were newer, and competition was fierce. For men like Watson, already late middle-aged with no pension to look forward to, the pressure was immense. A private grammar school had to attract paying families, or it simply would not survive. Standards had to be maintained, discipline upheld, and every part of the headmaster's conduct reflected on the school's financial future. Watson carried all on his shoulders. Long days of teaching Latin and mathematics, evening preparation, constant worries about accounts, and the perpetual anxiety that next term's enrolment might fall. By 1871, the stress of running a declining private school at a time when the entire educational system was shifting beneath him may well have formed part of the strain felt inside the Watson household, a strain that would soon be pushed to breaking point. The Reverend John Selby Watson was 67 years of age and by all accounts a deeply learned man, educated in the classics, fluent in Latin, and ordained in 1839. He began his career as a curate in Somerset before taking the headmastership of a proprietary grammar school in Stockwell in 1844. For many years the school prospered under him. He kept 2 servants, lived comfortably, and enjoyed a reputation for scholarship more than charisma. Watson himself was a hesitant speaker, nervous in the pulpit, inclined to stutter, and known to read sermons in a monotone that sometimes sent congregations quietly slipping out. But he was regarded as diligent, precise, and intellectually serious. By 1870, everything had changed. Enrollment had fallen, the governors dismissed him, and found at 67 he found himself rejected from every post he applied for. Financial strain forced him to dismiss one of the household servants, and domestic strain soon followed. Watson would later speak of a lifetime of provocation, of a marriage grown cold, of separate bedrooms, of constant correction and reproach. Those around him noticed he had become irritable, despondent, and prone to long, solitary walks. He was, in short, a man whose public standing had collapsed while he still lived in its shadow, a man ill-equipped for the pressures that now hemmed him in on all sides. Annie Watson. She was 62 years of age at the time of the incident, was born in Dublin, the daughter of a man whose fortunes were ruined by the failure of French's bank. The collapse left the family almost penniless, and she and her sisters were compelled to earn their living as governesses, a common but precarious occupation for middle-class women suddenly cast adrift. It was during Watson's years at Trinity College, Dublin, that the two had met. Their courtship lasted an extraordinary 12 years before they married at St. Mark's Church, suggesting both attachment and patience in a life lived with modest means. Contemporary accounts describe Mrs. Watson as a woman of strong will and sharp manner, nagging, as some newspapers put it. Though such reports often reflected Victorian expectations of wifely meekness as much as the reality of a marriage. What is clear is that the couple's relationship had become strained. She corrected her husband frequently, resented certain clerical duties he undertook for others, and would sometimes forbid him to visit fellow clergymen. Watson, unwilling to confront her directly, would slip out quietly to fulfill his obligations, only to return to scenes of temper and reproach. Neighbours noticed her scolding, and noticed too how often Watson walked alone up and down Stockwell Park Road afterwards, agitated and deep in thought. For a couple once bound by 12 years of courtship, theirs had become a household marked by tension, disappointment, and two people living parallel lives under one roof. The story opens on a mid-October morning in London in 1871. Startled by unsettling moans from her master's bedroom, Ellen Pine, the household's quick-thinking servant girl, immediately sought the nearest doctor. It would be the beginning of a sequence of extraordinary events. From the Weekly Dispatch, the 15th of October, 1871, extraordinary and frightful tragedy at Stockwell. An extraordinary and frightful tragedy was brought to light on Wednesday at the house of the Reverend J. S. Watson, M.A., who was for many years headmaster of the proprietary grammar school at Stockwell. The reverend gentleman resided with his wife and a female servant named Ellen Payne, who had lived with them for 3 years in a large home in St. Martin's Road at the back of Stockwell Crescent. From the statement of the young woman, it would seem that on Sunday evening last she left the house and did not return until nearly 10 o'clock. When she left, Mr. Watson and his wife were sitting in the library on the first floor, which is between Mr. Watson's bedroom and a small bedroom unoccupied at the back. When she returned, her master told her that her mistress had left for the country and would be absent for 5 or 6 days. She was a little surprised at this communication, but made no comment, and from her statement did not seem to think much about it. Mr. Watson retired to rest at the usual time. No disorder was apparent in the room, but the next morning the girl called the attention of her master to a large stain on the carpet on the floor near the library door, when he replied with great coolness, "Oh, there was an accident last night. I spilt a decanter of port wine there and wiped it up as well as I could." On Monday evening Mr. Watson retired to rest at his usual time. The following day he seemed to have spent much the same as the preceding one, with the exception that he was seen walking in the Clapham Road. Tuesday passed in a similar fashion, except for a solitary walk along Clapham Road, a walk whose purpose soon became clear. It now turns out that, having committed the murder, the course he had determined upon was to poison himself with prussic acid, and the subsequent inquiries of Dr. Rugg have resulted in obtaining the information that the object of his walk on the Tuesday was to buy the drug. At the first chemist's shop at which he applied, although well known, the proprietor refused to serve him. Dr. Rugg was sent for at the request of the prisoner on Tuesday morning. In a short time Dr. Rugg was at the house, and on being admitted the servant put a letter into his hand, the effect of which was to give him such a shock that he almost dropped to the ground. The letter stated, "In a fit of fury I have killed my wife. Often I have endeavoured to restrain myself, but my rage overcame me and I struck her down. Her body will be found in the little room of the library. The key is in a letter on the table. I hope that she will be buried as becomes a lady of birth and position. She is an Irish lady and her name is Anne." On seeing this letter, Dr. Rugg immediately rushed upstairs to the bedside of Mr. Watson, whom he found in a very weak state and speechless, apparently suffering from some violent poison, which had not, however, taken effect. He administered a sedative and proceeded at once to the chamber indicated in company with the servant girl. There a horrible spectacle confronted him. Huddled up in a corner of the room, her knees touching her chest, her hands convulsively clenched, and her head fallen over to her chest, was the body of the unhappy lady, her clothes saturated with blood, which still seemed to ooze from the body in a dark, almost purple pool. On examining her, Dr. Rugg found her head smashed in, and places beaten almost to jelly. There was, in addition to numerous other wounds, a fracture of the skull, sufficient probably to cause death. Both her temples were beaten in, and there was a deep wound in the middle of her forehead. At this time the wretched man lay on his bed in a half insensible state, although slowly recovering. Dr Rugg, though personally acquainted with Watson, understood immediately that his duty was clear. He stated the police must be apprised of the sad occurrence. Under the pretense of preparing medicine, he slipped into the street and sent word to Brixton Police Station. Inspector Davis and Sergeant Hazel soon arrived, by which time Watson had regained enough strength to speak. Rugg informed him that the letter had been read and the body discovered. The Reverend Watson replied only, I suppose so. It must be so. He offered no further explanation. Still dulled by the poison he had attempted to take, he seemed unable or unwilling to comprehend the gravity of his situation. He remained in the house for several hours before being taken to the police station. On subsequently searching the premises, the police soon discovered the clothes in which the murder had been committed, saturated with blood. Indeed, almost every outer garment he had on was sprinkled with the evidence of the crime, showing the frightful fury with which the unfortunate victim had been struck. They appeared to have been sitting near a window in the library when the quarrel began, and the poor woman was murdered in her chair, which was found covered with blood. The windowsill, the frame, and a wire blind were also covered with spots. Having committed the murder, it would appear that as if Mr. Watson had raised the body in his arms and carried it across the library for the purpose of hiding it in the little room also already mentioned. But the library door being closed, he was obliged to rest his hideous burden at the door, which accounted for the dark blood stain there noticed by the girl, and which was subsequently been wiped up by him. It seems to have thrown the body pell-mell into the corner where it was found and simply cast an old blanket over it. Having apparently made up his mind to poison himself, he proceeded deliberately to set about arranging his affairs. A small bottle containing a very diluted mixture, but in which there were clear traces of acid, were found on a chair by the bedside by Dr Rugg, which had already been handed over to the police. Either the courage of Dr Watson must have failed him, or he must have thought that he had taken enough, for a full half of the mixture was found in the bottle. The attention of the servant, aroused by 2 previous warnings, was called to the doctor by a moaning noise which he was making, and she naturally imagined that at the time he told her to send to Dr Rugg if anything happened to him when he felt unwell. The examination of the accused. At the Lambeth Police Court, the Reverend John Selby Watson, aged 67 and still visibly weakened, was brought before Mr Ellison, charged upon his own confession with the murder of his wife, Anne. He was permitted to sit owing to what the papers described as extreme nervousness. The first witness called was the servant Ellen Pine. She stated, I live with the Reverend Mr Watson, 28 St Martin's Road in Stockwell. I am a general servant and have lived there for 3 years next February. Much of her account concerned the Sunday evening already described. Her departure, her return, Mr Watson's explanation that her mistress had gone out of town, and the now familiar reference to the port wine stain. But her testimony then moved into new and revealing detail. She explained that on Tuesday morning Watson told her If you should find anything wrong with me in the morning, go for Dr. Rugg. When asked if he was ill, he replied only, I may require medicine in the morning. Later that day, hearing a groan from his bedroom, she entered and found him lying unconscious. On a chair nearby were several papers in his handwriting, one addressed to the servant Ellen Pine, exclusive of her wages. Inside was a £5 note. It also contained the line, Let no suspicion fall upon the servant, whom I believe to be a good girl. Ellen stated that she replaced the papers exactly as she found them and ran at once for Dr. Rugg. She concluded, I did not see my mistress till this morning. The witness then burst into tears. She continued, I saw the body in the back room on the bedstead, in a room adjoining the library. I had not been in the room for months till this morning. It was a spare bedroom, and Mrs. Watson occupied it herself for 2 or 3 months, up to the time of her death. Mrs. Watson always attended to the room herself. I never heard any quarrelling between my master and mistress, but they were always very quiet. They have always appeared happy. I did not see the contents of the other papers that were on the chair, and I left them on the chair with the glass produced. Ellen continued, I am 20 years old. My master used to keep 2 servants. He ceased to keep 2 servants last Christmas. I know that my master had been headmaster of the Stockwell grammar school, but I think he ceased to be the master last midsummer. Mr. and Mrs. Watson only occupied separate bedrooms since the hot weather. They never occupied separate rooms before, since I had been there. I think my mistress was a little hasty at times, but not violent. I never heard any angry words passing between them at any time. I've never noticed anything particular about my master except that he was always very quiet and kept to himself. Except when he took his meals, he always sat in his library, sometimes reading and sometimes writing. The next witness was Dr. George Rugg, a long-standing acquaintance of Watson's. He told the court that he had been summoned to the house shortly before midday, where he found the clergyman lying in bed, unconscious, breathing with difficulty, and showing signs that at first suggested an epileptic attack. The servant then placed a letter in his hand. The letter addressed to the surgeon. Dr. Rugg read it aloud to the court. I have killed my wife in a fit of rage to which she provoked me. Often she has provoked me before, but I never lost restraint over myself with her till the present occasion, when I allowed fury to carry me away. Her body will be found in the room adjoining, the key of which I have with this paper. I trust she will be buried with the attention due to a lady of good birth. She is an Irish woman. Her name is Anne. Rugg took the key mentioned in the letter and opened the small adjoining room. There he found Mrs. Watson's body huddled in a corner beneath a blanket. He testified, I discovered 6 wounds on the scalp, one of which had penetrated the skull. The outer table of the skull was completely crushed. The wounds are all contused, lacerated ones, and have evidently been caused by some hard, blunt instrument. The butt end of the pistol produced would be such an instrument. When Rugg returned to the bedroom, he found Watson beginning to recover consciousness. The prisoner told him he had been taking poison, prussic acid, and added that he had taken some the previous day, but not enough. Dr. Rugg continued regarding his conversation with the Reverend Watson. I asked him if he would like to see a solicitor, and he said, No, I do not wish to see anyone. The deed is done, and it's no use. After he was taken to the station, I again asked him about a solicitor and advised him. Previous to leaving the house to go to the station, I may mention a circumstance. The prisoner called my attention to an oyster shell as a curiosity. I asked him if he had anything on his mind or if his means were bad. He said, "I have sufficient, but my means are getting exhausted, and of course losing the grammar school has affected me. I have lost another appointment which I had been promised." Dr Rugg also told the court that Watson had left behind a long reflective note, part instructions about his books and property, part a farewell address. In it he named a brother in America as heir, asked that his servant be generously compensated, and expressed regret that, in his own words, my great fault has been too much self-dependence and too little regard for others. It was a revealing document, melancholy, meticulous, and tinged with an air of finality. But the magistrate's court could only establish the bare outlines. The full circumstances of Mrs. Watson's death and the question of her husband's intent would now move to a higher forum, and so the next morning the inquest opened. The inquest. At 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, Mr. William Carter opened the investigation at the Greenwich Arms Tavern in Sydney Road in Stockwell, touching the death of Mrs. Annie Watson. Startling disclosures. On Thursday night, the detective police, acting under the orders of Inspector Davis, purposely engaged in endeavouring to ascertain facts that might throw some light upon the mystery of the murder of Mrs. Annie Watson, and during the course of their inquiry they ascertained the following. On Monday morning, which is presumed to be the morning following the day on which the murder was committed, the Reverend Mr. Watson, the husband of the deceased, entered the shop of a Mr. Turner, a packing case maker, carrying on business at Clapham Road, and requested to see the proprietor. The reverend gentleman was then very cool and collected, and upon Mr. Turner making his appearance, he said to him, "I want you to make a chest for me, and I want it done sharp, and it must be air and watertight, for I want to send it by rail." Mr. Turner then asked him whether he would wish the chest to be iron-bound, and Mr. Watson replied in the affirmative. He was then asked to give the dimensions of the box required, and he said, "I wish it to be 2 feet 9 inches in length, and 2 feet 3 inches in width, and 1 foot 9 inches in depth. Send it home to my house tomorrow, for I want to pack some things in it and send it off." Mr. Turner said to him, "Are you going to send it on a sea voyage?" And he replied, "No, but I want to keep it free from water." The box was made, and on Tuesday morning Dr. Watson called again at Mr. Turner's and said, "I don't want it sent round to my house today." He paid Mr. Turner for the box. He then appeared to be rather thoughtful and reticent. A measurement of the crouched body of the deceased lady now shows that her corpse could have been fitted into the box which was ordered. From the Illustrated Police News, the 21st of October, 1871, the dreadful tragedy at Stockwell. Further police evidence was then heard. Sergeant George Hazel described entering the house with Dr. Rugg on the Wednesday morning and finding Mrs. Watson's body lying huddled in the small room off the library. 2 letters were handed to him, one of which was clearly referred to the lady's death. Hazel then went to the adjoining bedroom, and where the clergyman lay on the bed, he told the court, "I said to him, 'I arrest you for the murder of your wife.' He replied, 'I suppose so. Don't be violent.' I asked, "I'm not going to be violent." He said, "I'm ill." The sergeant went on to describe the physical evidence discovered in the house. A shirt belonging to Watson was found with the wristbands torn and bloodstains on both sleeves. On the landing he noticed patches of dried blood, as though a body or blooded clothing had been dragged across the carpet and later wiped. In the library he found an old flint pistol, about 12 inches in length, and a new hammer still wrapped in paper. A sponge stained with blood and holding several whitish red hairs was also recovered. A post-mortem was carried out by Dr Rugg, assisted by the divisional surgeon, and both agreed that Mrs Watson's death had resulted solely from the severe head wounds. They confirmed the skull to be completely broken in and the membranes of the brain exposed. Beyond this, the papers reported various smaller details. Watson requesting an inventory of the household linen from prison, his great black dog barking furiously as police examined the blood-stained carpet, crowds gathering in the street to trade rumours of the affair. Amongst the slips of paper found on Watson's table was a note written in Latin, translated by the press as "happy in almost all things, except so far as concerns a woman as hard as a stone. It has often ere now hurt a loving person to persist in loving." The inquest concluded with a verdict of wilful murder against the accused. With the inquest concluded and a verdict of wilful murder returned, the case now moved into its next and more contentious stage. Witness had confessed, that much was never in dispute. The question now was whether he had been in his right mind when he struck the fatal blows. For months the defence would press hard for a verdict of insanity, while the prosecution pointed relentlessly to one stubborn piece of evidence, the box he had ordered in advance with its exact measurements, its waterproofing and its iron bindings, a box into which his wife's body would fit perfectly. At a further inquest before the magistrates, newspapers remarked on Watson's behaviour in jail. Quiet, composed, spending his days reading and speaking to no one but his solicitor. The defence would later point to this as evidence of a disturbed mind. The prosecution saw only self-containment. A second charge was also laid against him for attempting to take his own life with prussic acid. With no new evidence offered, Watson was again remanded while the authorities analysed the remaining liquid found in his room. From the Illustrated Police News, the 12th of October 1871, the dreadful tragedy at Stockwell. Some additional particulars in connection with the tragedy at Stockwell have been gleaned, and they tend to illustrate the domestic understanding between the accused and the victim. An ex-parish clerk who was in the service of the Reverend Mrs. Watson had made the following statement. He says that for the last 20 years he had been acquainted with the Reverend Mr. Watson, who, after leaving the grammar school last Christmas, became irritable and at times despondent. The wife, who was of a nagging disposition, then became even more so. The accused, the Reverend Mr. Watson, preached at St. Andrew's Church in Stockwell Park Road. Whenever he ascended the pulpit to deliver a sermon, the congregation were invariably struck with his hesitating and nervous manner, and frequently left the church while he was reading in a monotonous tone a manuscript sermon. It appears that the custom of Reverend Mr. Holmes in officiating for the Reverend Mr. Clissold seemed to have caused some unpleasantness with his wife. Mrs. Watson, upon learning the nature of a visit to the Reverend Mr. Clissold, would say in a sharp tone, "You shan't go." The Reverend Mr. Watson would agree with her wishes, then would slip out of the house unseen by her to attend the duties required of him. Upon his return, Mrs. Watson would become ill-tempered and frequently abuse him. She was in the habit of reminding her husband of the mistakes he had made in his life, and after listening to her remarks, he would go down from the house and walk up and down the Stockwell Park Road in a manner that excited the attention of passers-by. It became more and more evident that the purpose for which the large box was ordered by Mr. Watson was in order to remove the corpse of his murdered wife. It would seem, however, that second thoughts led to the abandonment of this plan, as far as sending her murdered corpse some distance by rail. Had the box been delivered and taken by the murderer upstairs, the accused, the Reverend Mr. Holmes, might easily have placed the body of his victim doubled and crunched up as it was inside. But then came the difficulty of how the box was to be got down again. On the same day that he ordered the box, it is believed that he purchased a coil of new rope for a quantity sufficient to cord the chest was found in the library, after which he was taken into custody. A further hearing before the magistrate added little to what had already been revealed. Through the forensic evidence was now more firmly established. Dr. Mutter of the South London School of Chemistry had analysed the bottles found in Watson's room and confirmed them to contain hydrocyanic acid, though of a weaker strength than the standard preparation. He also identified bloodstains on the prisoner's clothing and on the stained pistol found in the library. He detected particles of skin. A sponge recovered nearby held a dozen light grey hairs. The trunk maker, Charles Turner, also repeated his earlier account, adding only that Watson had first asked to see ordinary trunks, but rejected them as not strong enough, before ordering the specially measured packing case. When cautioned, Watson simply murmured that he had nothing to say, and he was committed for trial. From the Western Daily Press, the 11th of January 1872, the trial of the Reverend J.S. Watson. The Reverend John Selby Watson was yesterday placed on trial at the Central Criminal Court before Mr. Justice Biles, charged with the wilful murder of his wife, Anne Watson. The prisoner, described as 65 years of age and a clerk in holy orders, exhibited a careworn and dejected appearance when placed at the bar, and he pleaded not guilty in a low tone. The Honourable G. Denman opened the case, stating the facts and referring to the anticipated defence of insanity, but added that, in the opinion of the surgeons of both the Surrey County Prison and Newgate, such a defence could not be sustained. Sergeant Parry appeared for the prisoner and confined his cross-examination to matters bearing on the question of sanity. Dr. Rugg said the accused seemed despondent, and that from now he knew he believed him insane. Police evidence was then given as to the condition of the rooms, and the trunk maker repeated that the chest had been ordered but never delivered, the prisoner paying for it with a £10 note. From the Western Daily Press, the 13th of January 1872, the trial of the Reverend J.S. Watson. Sentence of death. This trial was brought to a conclusion last evening. The first witness called was the Reverend Joseph Wallace, a vicar of Stockwell. He stated that no man could have a higher character for kindness and humanity than the prisoner, whom he had known for 10 years. When Wallace visited Watson in Horsemonger Lane Jail on the 3rd of November, he found him forgetful, rambling rapidly from subject to subject, and very likely and unlike his former self. Watson spoke of the horrible inquest, complained that they won't let me shave, and appeared far more troubled about the dismantling of his house and the sale of his library than the crime itself. At one point he said, "Here's a man who can write Latin, which the Bishop of Winchester would commend, shut up in a place like this." He also expressed concern that he would have no home to return to, and hoped the authorities would allow him access to books so he might write an essay on the union of church and state. Several medical witnesses were then called. Dr. Maudsley testified that he had no doubt the prisoner suffered from melancholia, citing the case of Charles Lamb's sister as an illustration. The prisoner had told him that his wife was of a hasty temper and had said something which aggravated him, and he had struck her on the head with a pistol. Dr. Blanford agreed, adding that Watson expressed little of the sorrow or regret that might have been expected. Dr. Joseph Rogers concurred, stating that Watson admitted that they had quarrelled and that he then did the deed. Mr. Poland asked one of the witnesses whether the prisoner had mentioned the ordering of the box, and the witness replied, "Yes." He shrugged his shoulders and said it was not for the purpose assumed, and this closed the case for the defence. The jury retired at 5 o'clock and returned after an hour and a half with a verdict of guilty, recommending the prisoner to mercy on account of his age and previous character. When asked if he had anything to say, the prisoner replied in broken accents, "I only wish to say that the defence maintained in my favour was just and honest." The judge, in passing sentence, said that no one who had heard the case could regard it otherwise than with the deepest compassion. He then pronounced the usual sentence of death. Although the medical testimony had been exhaustive, and all agreed that the Reverend Watson was not insane, the verdict did not settle the matter in the public mind. England in the early 1870s was already beginning to recoil from the spectacle of execution. Hangings were now carried out behind prison walls, and each year the appetite for capital punishment grew a little fainter, and this case was unusually uncomfortable. For all the grisly horror of the crime, a skull shattered so completely that one reporter compared it to jelly, there remained a deep well of sympathy for the prisoner. Watson had spent 20 years teaching local boys, serving the church, and living an outwardly blameless life. His neighbours remembered a mild, scholarly figure. Parents recalled his patience, parishioners his nervous, hesitant sermons. Mrs. Watson, by contrast, had not endeared herself to the community. Fairly or not, Victorian observers were quick to describe her as sharp-tongued and reproachful. Difficult and much such impressions, however biased, coloured the public mood. More than one commentator hinted that the tragedy reflected a marriage long marred by unhappiness rather than inherent wickedness. As the sentence of death was pronounced, petitions for mercy began to circulate. Clergymen, former pupils, old colleagues, and local residents appealed to the Home Secretary for leniency, arguing that age, character, and mental strain ought to temper the law's severity, and, remarkably, it worked. In early February 1872, the Reverend John Selby Watson's death sentence was formally commuted to life imprisonment, a decision that divided opinion but reflected a changing era, a moment when Victorian justice, faced with a man of learning, reputation and tragic decline, hesitated at the noose. From the Western Daily Express, the 27th of February 1872, the Reverend J.S. Watson, whose capital sentence is commuted to imprisonment for life, has now been removed from Horsemonger Lane Jail to Pentonville Prison, where the commuted sentence will be undergone. The trial may have ended, but public opinion did not settle quite so easily. For some, the commutation was an act of mercy, but befitting a nation growing uneasy with capital punishment. For others, it was a dangerous indulgence, a sign that learning and clerical status could soften the law where a labourer might have swung. In the end, the Watson case left Victorian London with no comfortable conclusions, only the image of a once respected clergyman, a broken marriage, and a crime committed with such ferocity that even the courts struggled to reconcile the man with the deed. It remained one of the most unsettling domestic murders of the decade, not because of mystery, Watson confessed, but because of motive. A lifetime of pressure, bitterness, and silence erupting in a single catastrophic moment. Epilogue. The Exeter Flying Post was firm in its condemnation. The insanity defence, it argued, had been thoroughly discredited, and if anything, Watson's clerical standing only heightened the atrocity. A man entrusted with moral leadership, they wrote, ought to be judged by a high standard, not a low one. After the commutation of his death sentence, the Reverend John Selby Watson was transferred to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight. There he spent the remaining years of his life in quiet obscurity, reading, writing, and rarely speaking of the crime that had destroyed his marriage and reputation. On the 6th of July 1884, at the age of 80, Watson died after falling from his prison hammock, an ignominious and lonely end to a life once marked by scholarship, service, and a tragic collapse for which he never recovered. Further particulars. And in today's further particulars, we return to the Victorian court, not for murder, but for something far more contentious: cats. A lady of good breeding insists she has been sold a Persian stud, only to receive what appears to be a London street philosopher with whiskers. 3 cats, 2 furious women, and 1 increasingly confused judge later, a verdict is reached. Without further ado, we present the case of the counterfeit Persian cat. Cat, not person. Friday, the 28th p.m. The Illustrated Police News on the 9th of March 1895. At the Bloomsbury County Court, Judge Bacon heard an amusing case in which Miss Ursula Coburn Dickinson sued Mrs. Sarah Clements for the return of £2 2 shillings, the price paid for a sable-coloured Persian cat, which the plaintiff alleged was not equal to the warranty. The plaintiff, who resides at Lonsborough Lodge in London Road, Worcester Park, stated that she was very fond of Persian cats and possessed a very fine female specimen whom she called by the pet name of Queen May. For some time she, Miss Dickinson, had been desirous of obtaining a companion for the animal, and at the beginning of the present year she saw an advertisement and, in consequence, wrote to the defendant at Rochester Place in Camden Road, Kentish Town. After some correspondence, it was arranged that she would have a cat for £2 2s, the animal being guaranteed to be a dark sable tabby Persian stud cat. But Miss Dickinson informed His Honour that, being suspicious that all was not as it seemed, she said she would only take it on sale or return. To convince her, the defendant said she would cut a bit of fur off the cat's back and send it to her by post. This being done, the plaintiff sent the money and received the cat. To her surprise, she found that the animal sent was not a Persian cat at all, but only an ordinary London tomcat. Laughter. She wrote to the defendant accusing her of palming off a sham upon her and demanding the return of her money. This course, however, was not adopted. The defendant assured His Honour that the cat sold was a Persian one, sable, tabby, and a male. She would be glad if His Honour could only see the cat. Her husband, a naturalist, had lately died, and she was giving up the business. The plaintiff called her maidservant, who proceeded to place on the registrar's table in front of the learned judge 3 baskets. On the first being opened, a magnificent Persian cat stepped out and was introduced to the judge as Queen May. The second basket was then opened, the plaintiff at the same time remarking as another cat appeared, "This, Your Honour, is the miserable specimen she sent me." The defendant, picking up the rejected cat and balancing it in her hand, "Miserable? Yes, it isn't half the cat it was when he left his home." The plaintiff, "What? If it hadn't been for the kindness he has received from me, it would have been dead long since." The third box was then opened, and the occupant, another cat, the plaintiff said, was an animal caught on the walls, an ordinary London tomcat, and appealed to the learned judge to say whether the defendant's cat was not the same breed. Laughter. His Honour, after inspecting Queen May and her companions, said he did not know very much about cats. He could, however, see that the one sold to the plaintiff was not of a Persian breed, and gave judgment for the plaintiff, a decision which was received with applause by a crowded and vastly amused court. And so, from feline disputes in courtrooms to bodies flung pell-mell into corners, we have reached the end of our episode. If you've enjoyed the show, we would be tremendously grateful for a like and a subscribe if you haven't already. Our subscriber count moves at a glacial pace, as though trapped somewhere in the land of perpetual snow. Feel free to share us with your cat fancier friends, and of course there's the gold standard of YouTube approval, the mysterious hype. Not a new festive dance move, sadly, merely a magic button that appears or vanishes entirely according to its mood. Should it grace you with its presence, please do give it a tap. There's a good fellow. And if you'd like even more history, mischief, we have over 800 episodes waiting for you, along with Patreon exclusive series such as Mysterious Britain, Ye Oldie Newsroom, and of course our weekly recounting of our studio-based chaos, Robin & Co. You can find us at patreon.com/News of the Times. historical crime, where your support helps keep the archive growing and the kettle boiling. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, part-time Victorian cloud inspector, amateur thimble archivist, and fully qualified organiser of unnecessary complicated drawers. Until we meet again, do remember to dust your crime shelf alphabetically and never trust a cat claiming to be Persian.